So one way to get a window into the future is to survey the leading practitioners of it. So we conducted a survey of commercial AI startup firms. Now you all know the limitations of surveys. This may also not be the right window to look into the future. There's some people who argue that startups are not going to be that important in this wave of technology as they were in previous waves of technology, that it's all going to be big companies, and I'll return to that later. What I'm going to show you is some preliminary results from our survey. The survey was ongoing at the time this data was pulled, but we can still see some interesting things. So the main list for the survey was taken from Crunchbase. We filtered on firms that had received funding. They were real firms that were in the AI space. We also supplemented that with a list of startups, AI startups from the Creative Destruction Lab, and O'Reilly Media publicized it, so we had a website, and some others who somehow didn't make it onto the Crunchbase list filtered through. The question, the trick is asking as many questions as you can in a 10-minute survey. So we asked a lot. Things about the firm, and for the Crunchbase data, we also had Crunchbase data on the firms. Things about the characteristics of their customers, the technology that they used, various sorts and their product. A number of questions about data, what type of data they were using, where they got it from, their customer or their own data, what sort of protections they had, what sort of legal contracts they had around data, some detailed information about customer benefits and costs, skill and training requirements, and impact on jobs by occupation. So I'll show you a sampling of results in my 10 minutes. So this comes from a time when we had 177 responses. For the Crunchbase set, it's a 7% response rate, but we're not actually sure how much of the Crunchbase firms are actually still in existence, so maybe a little bit higher. Comparing the respondents to the non-respondents, essentially there's no statistically significant difference. Our respondents may be slightly smaller companies than the Crunchbase sample as a whole, so it seems to be representative. The customer location mirrors to a great degree the firm location, which mirrors the Crunchbase sample, but you see it's North America dominated. The firms that we're dealing with, these are the startup firms, are largely small firms, not a big surprise, almost all of them under 50. Their customers are across the industrial spectrum, including individual consumers for about a little over a third. But every major sector, law enforcement and agriculture, not so much maybe, but pretty broad distribution. The people who are the users of these systems in the customer firms tend to be professionals, managers, and sales. That's important for something later. All right, so okay. I've got about 5 minutes. Good. Okay. So I wanted to sort of take a deeper dive into just a couple of bigger questions. One is this question: is AI really for big firms only, or do startups and small firms and mid-sized firms have a role to play? So, one of the arguments is that if you look at the money being spent, McKinsey did this survey and they identified 9 firms that are the major spenders on AI, and they are accounting for a lion's share. Is there any hope for anybody else? There's also these issues about data and data access. So there are a lot of concerns that the more data you have, the better AI you can build, and does that give an inherent advantage to large companies? There may be some pushback on that. There's some evidence that it may not be the size of the data, but what you do with it. In any case, we can get some sort of sense about how significant that is. Thanks. For our startup firms. So one thing we see, if we compare the distribution of customer sizes to the distribution of all firms from the longitudinal business database of the U.S. Census, that is U.S. What you see is essentially that the customers of these startups are disproportionately mid-sized firms. that makes sense. They're not going to compete against the large firms. They're not going to sell to the large firms who are big enough to do their own AI, and the smaller firms aren't going to maybe be able to afford these systems. Data isn't always a barrier. So, and actually for most of these firms, 80% of them use customer data. They may also use their own data or publicly available data, or data from third-party sources. But we're seeing very few of them are using only their own data. So their own access to data is not a fatal limitation. It may still be a significant limitation. So we ask questions about how do your customers benefit from the technology? And we asked a range of things. These are the strongly agree percentages. So the number one thing is it helps their customers make better predictions or decisions. Somebody should write a book about that. But there's this sort of debate about augmenting versus replacing. Two of these are, automate routine tasks or reduce labor costs. We also have reduce other product costs. But what you see is most of the things and the most popular things are very much about adding capabilities to the firm rather than saving them costs. If we tally them up and look at the totals for augmenting versus replacing, basically everybody is providing some sort of augmenting capability to their customers. About half are doing some sort of replacing of labor or reducing costs. We asked them questions about, are you eliminating or destroying jobs in various occupational categories? And this is sort of a result that, that fits very well with sort of what I think many people see as the historical pattern for IT over the last 20 or 30 years. What we're seeing is jobs are being added in managerial professions, professional professions, and sales and marketing, and jobs are being lost in clerical, manual workers, and frontline service workers. Again, if we tally these up, what we get is most of these firms are, actually the biggest bunch is both creating and eliminating jobs. Some firms are only eliminating jobs, some firms are only creating jobs, but they're about equal. There doesn't seem to be any big wash one way or the other. If you take it with a few grains of salt, it seems to be a story kind of like what we're seeing, that there may be not so much a net job effect, but it's the distributional effects that are mattering. And this is what we were talking about earlier. We're seeing that playing out with where these startups are going. So to summarize, the startups tend to serve mid-sized firms. They use other people's data, and there's not evidence that data itself is an entry barrier, at least in these markets. In other words, these are the firms that were able to find data that from their customers that they could use and get into business. That doesn't mean there weren't entry barriers elsewhere. Customer benefits seem to be more about augmentation than replacement of humans, but there certainly is, a significant part that's directed towards replacing humans or automating tasks. And the main effect on jobs, taken with a grain of salt, seems to be very much more about distribution, about some typically lesser skilled jobs being cut and higher skilled jobs being added to. Thank you.